Today, we're turning our focus to Bangladesh, a country with a vibrant civil society and long history of women's activism, but also one where fundamental rights, especially women's rights, are under growing pressure.
From labor protections and political participation to freedom of expression and gender-based violence, there's continued struggle over rights in Bangladesh.
Our guest today, Rafia Khondoker, a human rights advocate whose work sits at the intersection of gender, law, and social justice in Bangladesh.
Rafia is a student who's been closely engaged in efforts to advance women's rights and to document how legal frameworks and political realities shape everyday experiences on the ground.
In this conversation with her, we're going to talk about the current state of human rights in Bangladesh, the specific challenges facing women and girls, and what both local and international actors can do effectively to support meaningful change.
Bangladesh's Constitutional Commission proposed a series of constitutional reforms that were approved by 4 out of 5 voters in early February. It's incredible. So now the situation is, will that political pressure lead the government to actually introducing these constitutional reforms? No one knows for sure, but it strikes me that that's an overwhelming pressure from the society. And so there will be some changes in Bangladesh, and let's watch it in months to come.
My name is Uswatun Rafia. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Dhaka, and I'm currently one of the executive members of Dhaka University Central Students Union.
Fantastic. And we had met, of course, in Dhaka just a couple of weeks ago, and I was really struck by your story, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us a little more about it. I'll just begin by saying Bangladesh is this very important, huge country, one of the top 10 biggest in the world, that people outside don't pay enough attention to, mainly because of your neighborhood. And yet what has gone on there has been so remarkable. So maybe to start, I'll ask you to tell us what happened in Bangladesh in 2024. What happened that year, and what was it like to be there?
Okay. So, well, it started with a student-led quota protests demanding a fair public recruitment. To give you a little context, there was a 56% quota system on the government job sector, which was reinstated by a High Court ruling on, I believe it was on the 5th June of 2024. So the students, they took to the streets and demanded reforms to the quota system. So it was basically a peaceful protest and demonstrations, which later rapidly transformed into this huge nationwide uprising after the government's authorities started this crackdown on the students, and they were beating people up. There was this huge death toll caused by the government as the repression slowly intensified, and peaceful demonstrations, it turned into a broader movement against the authoritarian rule. I believe July was basically a ticking point, if I may say, because the people of Bangladesh has long been subjected to repression and violence by the army government, and we could not exercise any sort of freedom of speech. We did not have the voting rights. We were basically under a dictatorship. So it all fueled into this big uprising.
Can you explain to us, Rafia, when you say quota system, what kinds of quotas, like based on what, and what were they being given?
Okay, so it was a 56% quota system. And although our constitution allows for positive discrimination for the backwards section of our country, but in the quota system, there was this portion of quota registered for the freedom fighters who fought for the country in 1971, and not the freedom fighters, their grandsons and daughters, which was crazy to us because it was given as some sort of gratitude, but which in itself was unconstitutional because our constitution does not allow for a gratulatory quota system. And students, they were looking for a quota reform and not an abolition in entirety.
Right. And just for context, the Awami League was the independence party that, of course, had turned this into a sinecure for themselves and their supporters. So the students blew up. So It's known as the July Revolution. Can you just take us back there and tell us what it was like to be in the middle of it for you?
I was actively involved in the movement from the very beginning, um, as the Shahbag More, the main point of the protests and demonstrations was right um, where my university is located. I was always in the streets and always in Shahbag. Sometimes I remember that it got so hot in Shahbag that the roads, it started melting away. I believe it's called asphalts. I remember that once it even stuck to my socks and burnt my feet a little bit as well. And I was also one of the very first persons to publicly call out the dictator Sheikh Hasina in media. She was already known as a murderous authoritarian dictator, but no one actually at that point of time dared to speak against her in front of the media, because and it was a given that if you are saying something against her, you're gonna have to face consequences. So after my video went viral, it further fueled the protest, and at the same time, it put my life under a direct threat of the government authorities. I went back to my hometown a few days later, and the my institution, amongst the others, they were all forcefully closed by the government in because they were trying to clamp down on the organizations. And during that time, I had reliable information that the police were after me. So I kind of I kind of stay hidden for a few days. And at that time, there was a complete internet shutdown. There was no internet available. We could not talk to our fellow protesters. We did not know what were happening. We could only make phone calls, and even then, the networks were very shaky, and we could very hardly hear what the other people were talking about. And I remember that when I was hidden, and I always kept this journal about the death tolls and what atrocities were taking places. And right before the internet shutdown happened, I believe it was on the night of 17th July, I had an interview with the BBC. I talked to them. I talked about my experience, what I have seen, the amount of atrocities, what were happening, and what the nation demands. And after that, I believe the most turning point was obviously the 5th August, which we say 36th July. And there, I was about 120 kilometers away from Dhaka, and even though I was that far away, I knew that I had to take part in the long march to Dhaka, which would snatch the capital away from the bloodthirsty government. And there was no proper transportation available at the time. So I walked part of the distance and used whatever vehicle was available at the time. There was CNGs, there was auto rickshaws, there was vans. And I traveled through multiple cities, me and my friends. Not only I had my friends with me as well, and we traveled through multiple cities. Usually it takes like 3 or 3.5 hours to get to Dhaka from my hometown, but I remember that day it took us almost more than 12 hours to get here. I remember my feet were tired and bloody from all the walking in an empty stomach, but my heart was so full of joy that okay, finally we are independent. I remember this one elderly guy who was sitting beside the road, and his face was, he was basically sulking. So in my mind, I thought that okay, maybe he's a fascist sympathizer. So I asked him that, why are you not celebrating? Why are you not laughing? He told me that, dude, I laughed so hard that I'm grasping for my breath right now. I'm trying to catch my breath and then I'll start laughing again. That kind of sums up what the nation felt after Hasina fled.
Obviously, there was a long-term injustice, and these quotas were depriving sort of, well, first a function of a government that you were objecting to, but also were not allowing people to take these positions through merit, right? They were sort of privileging people because of a historical affiliation. What was it that made you feel that you needed to organize and that you needed to actually do something? Like, was there one particular event that sort of pushed you over the edge, that kind of committed you to actually engaging in, public protests, like in a consistent way, or was it something that built in you slowly?
Well, I personally have always abhorred the government. I remember when I was in class 8 in 2018, there was also a nationwide uprising. It was called um, Nirapod Sorok Chai, road safety movement, basically. And although I was in class 8, I was perhaps, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 at that 13 at that time. I took to the streets, I protested, and I always understood what kind of repression the government was imposing on us. And this was not a news to us. It was an open secret. Everyone knew about it. We just did not perhaps talk about it aloud in public because we knew the consequences. They showed us that if you don't keep silence, we're going to do this and that. And it was not just a threat. We saw it firsthand. We experienced what had happened to others. So, day by day, like I said, July was a ticking point of the people. It was not just about the quota movement. It was not just about the imposed quota system. It was about the long standing repression, the lack of freedom of speech, the lack of freedom of expression, the pain of seeing other people tormented and not being able to do anything. Because if you don't stay silent, the pain will have to be endured by you. And perhaps for me, what I was not scared of about my personal well-being, but what they would do is that threaten by saying that, oh, you have your mother, right? You have a brother, right? We're gonna do this and that to you. And to, when they would say that this and that to you, we would be like, okay, we don't care if you die. But they would threaten you with your mother's safety, with your family's safety. So I we standard this for a long time, and slowly but surely it fueled a fire inside us. We had to we had to think that, okay, even if it costs our personal safety, our family's safety, we want the independence for our people, because at least someone has to make the sacrifices.
So you were saying that the August 5th is celebrated as July 36th. Can you
Yeah.
just explain that to us?
Yeah. Yes, of course. Basically, we commemorate the killings and the sacrifices our brothers and sisters made, and by stating that 36th July is when our struggle ended, because we pledged that we would not let July to die. We would not let July to end before we seek justice, before we avenge our brothers. So even after July ended, we pledged that no, July will only end when we avenge our brothers. And it ended while when the Hasina government fell, which was on the 5th August.
Can I ask about the aftermath? So Sheikh Hasina fled to your giant neighbor, India, of course, and the Awami League was banned thereafter. And we're in this kind of interim phase right now with an election to be held this month. The I'm wondering what happened to the remnants of the government supporters. There was an assassination recently. There seems to be some ongoing violence from them, and I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Having their political activities banned, Awami League, as unfortunate as it is, Awami League continues to terrorize the people of Bangladesh. A few days earlier, if I may talk about myself, the members of the banned group Chatra League, they torched my house, they lit my house on fire in order to silence me. And safe to say, they weren't quite successful, since I'm here talking to you guys now. When I think about July now, I do not see it as something that is over. And I think that that's the same for them too. They think that this is their birthright, this is their country. They can do whatever they want to us, since they fought perhaps in 1971. And that is the reason why I don't know if you know about this or not. Sheikh Hasina, the dictator Hasina, she has this Telegram group where she talks to her activists, and she says that the next time, if she comes to power again, it will be only for the reason that she will hang every single protesters of July. So, well, that is a very pessimistic thing to say, but well, now let's say something optimistic. We do hope that this is going to change soon, and since Awami League was banned, perhaps soon, if there is a democratic government, it will stop.
Looking ahead, what is your perspective? Are you optimistic? Are you worried? It's quite a critical juncture here for your country.
Um, have you ever heard of the Pandora's box? Yeah, it's a Greek mythological box that held all the sufferings in the world, all the pain, all the disease, all the things that are unpleasant. After everything was let out, the box was eventually shut. The only thing left inside was hope. We have that left, and we'll hold on to that till the end of times. And uh, if God forbid Hasina comes back again, we will hold on to this. We will again took to the streets and do whatever we have to do to snatch our independence. And well, it's understood if you see historically that after such uprising, after you make a government flee, it takes some time to reform your country. Even for a country like Bangladesh, where it's very hard. And since we don't have a democratically elected government now, we really hope that in the upcoming election afterwards, we will see some changes.
Rafia, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the situation of women in Bangladesh and gender equality more broadly. You know, on the other hand, on one hand, you have some female political leadership, whatever you might think about its quality, and some reserved seats in parliament for women. But then there's also there are all these areas of discrimination and oppression. So, can you talk a little bit about that and how you sort of see the areas where activists like you need to focus on?
If I talk about me personally, I get cyberbullied all the time. If I go into my inbox, my message requests, if I check them, it's all just I do not want to say this, but it's a very graphic details about how they're going to kill me, how they're going to rape me, how they're going to do this, how they're going to do that. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen to my fellow male protesters or male leaders. This does happen to them. However, I do not think that the scale is this bad. This, of course, since I'm a woman, I have to endure this even more. They would make AI videos of you clothless and other things, and this cyberbullying is so bad in Bangladesh right now that I do not know a single female activist that do not face this. And even though we lodge complaints, even though we file FIRs, the police does not seem to care as much. It's part of the reason is that because the police agency is infested with Awami fascist sympathizers. And like I said, it's very saddening to see because, of course, in 2024, in the streets of July, we did not see this coming, but it it's never going to stop us from doing the right thing. I can ensure that. And in order to actually, I actually do not know how to put a stop to this. Perhaps if the police and the law enforcement agencies were more active and they were more sympathized about the incidents about the woman, perhaps this could be resolved.
There's, I think, a lot of conversations in different communities about whether or not public protest is the most effective way to achieve change. And you sort of can look at this and know that there is movement and that it is able to accomplish something. But I'm just curious, like, about your analysis of like when is the right time to try to change policy in that way. Just curious about your analysis of this, both in the Bangladesh context and if you want to talk about other contexts, when you think that is the way to go, or if it always is the way to go.
If I talk about Bangladesh, Bangladesh has this long-standing history of this cycle of always facilitating fascism. If you looked into the history of Bangladesh, we tend to facilitate every government to turn into a dictator. I do not know how, but that happens. And um, if we date back to the Mughal period and even to the Afghan period, um, the Afghans used to call Bulgakpur, which translates into the place of revolution. So we would always just revolt against the dictators. We would always revolt against the government. So it kind of became a cultural thing that I sometimes talk to my friends about it, that every generation of Bangladesh, they in their youth, in their prime time, they witness an uprising. Like I have witnessed this, and my mother has witnessed the Irshad uprising in that period time. So, in the context of Bangladesh, I think you should take to the streets when you understand that this cannot be sorted out by a dialogue, and you understand that the government is not willing to sit with you. Rather, they would just torch your house, they would murder you rather than sit with you and have an actual dialogue and try to understand what you want. Now that should be the time when you take to the streets.
Can you tell us about the assassination of the student activist that happened? Yes,
Yes,
Hadi.
Hadi Bhai. Hadi Bhai was an independent candidate for the upcoming election. He was very close to my heart, so I do not. I usually do not want to get to this conversation because I tend to get emotional and teary eyed. But he was something that Bangladesh won't get for many years to come. I believe that because um, as much as, like I said, that Almi torched my house, but it could not silence me. But I believe that some part of me, it was fearful that my family would be put into danger or something. But Hadi Bhai did not fear a single thing. If you saw his videos, he would talk about how the fascist Hasina, and even in 2023, 2022, he would write against Hasina. He would write poetries. He would write everything that states that could be recorded as the Hasina was tormenting our people. And he was one of the few leaders that were not willing to compromise. Like after July, we saw that the leaders of the protest, many of them tried to compromise with the Awami League and the other fascist people. But he was someone who did not bow down to anyone. He was a very special individual to us. He when he got shot, I was not in Bangladesh. I was in China, and someone called me and told me that Hadi Bhai got shot. And I, at first, I could not fathom it. I actually did not want to believe it because I thought that, oh, that everyone loves that man. Why would someone do that? And of course, I knew that the fascist people, they do not like him, and there's high chance of him actually getting shot. I did not want to believe that. And it's just very saddening because it's been what, like 1 month and 10, 12 days, and the government did not seem to do anything. And we know very well that a part of the government, now government, and the fallen regime, they're part of this killing as well. And we're still seeking justice for him. I don't know when it will come, but I hope it comes soon because after July, to see our fellow protesters shot like that and murdered like that, that is as bad as it can get. I remember that one time while there was no internet, I we had to call our fellow protesters to see what was up and what was happening. Now back, I was in my hometown and I called someone in Dhaka, And I was asking what was happening because we did not have any news at all. And he was telling me that he said it like this, that Rafia, I'm seeing dead bodies being dragged from the streets by the police agencies and taken elsewhere so that they're not counted in the death toll. And we do not have any calculation as to how huge it was. And to hear it from someone, and he was witnessing it firsthand, he was looking at it from his home's veranda. We could not do anything at that time. We did not know when the protests were going to happen because we did not have any internet. So we would just be around the streets every time, look around if there's people coming, if there's hope coming, if there's something. That was a very different time.
We had our conversation with Rafia before the election. Was this a surprise? What direction did people think this was going to go in?
The election result was not a surprise. That Claudia's son is now going to be the prime minister, most likely. But I think the degree of public support for the reforms was a surprise to me and to some of the people I talked with. People weren't sure if it would get through because they didn't like the way the questions were phrased. There's a question about the legality, the legal status of a referendum. In Bangladesh, it's not actually allowed in the constitution. So I think what's going to happen is that this will play an enormous political role in pressuring the government to introduce the reforms, but they still have to go through the elites. And that can be a bit of a barrier in some processes of constitutional reform. So I'm still quite optimistic about the situation.
So, Tom, you know quite a lot about the Bangladesh context. And so I was curious, Rafia gave us this really powerful description of what it was like for her to be participating in the student movement to try to prompt political reform. But can you give us a little context for how this student movement came to be and what role it has played?
Yes, as she mentioned, it started with something called the quota system, which started as a mechanism for the Independence Party, the party that brought independence to the country in 1971, to reserve some seats, some government jobs, seats in universities for its members. And of course, that's a long time ago, but the descendants of those people are still supposed to get advantages in many things. And what it's really turned into was a kind of a stop for the ruling Awami League party. And, when they were increasing those quotas, the society, people just felt like there was nowhere to go. There was no opportunity that was not no opportunity that was available to them unless they were members of this party. And that just led to initially students rising up. But then there was so much discontent with the dictatorship, it led to a broader social reform. And of course, they did kick out the dictator, and she's now living in India.
So, can you describe what events played out? Because we say they kicked out the dictator. It sounds so easy, right? But obviously, it was not. And so, how did the events build, and what needed to happen, or what needed to be put in place for that kind of end result to be a reality?
Yeah, well, at the beginning, of course, it was just a student protest over this particular issue, but there was a brutal crackdown. The police came in and just killed people, and that led to that repression led to an increase in public support for the students. And they had this very interesting thing where they had said, we're not going to leave until she's gone. And we're in the month of July. This was July 2024. In the end, what happened is it took until August 5th. And so they named that date July 36th, the 36th of July. So they're saying still in July she was kicked out. It was the July Revolution. And of course, it was a year later when the July Charter was put out. That was the document, proposed constitutional reforms, which the country just voted on last week.
One thing that I was really struck by when I was listening to her, she described these really awful experiences, her people that she's organizing with dying, the things that her fellow organizers were seeing. I wonder if you have sort of reflections about the role of students and the kind of protest that we're seeing in Bangladesh, and I don't know what it sort of means to you about democracy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time. We're seeing in many countries, young people are rising up. Just in South Asia, you had Sri Lanka in 2022, you had Nepal this last summer. and of course Bangladesh. And in each of those cases, the student movements were effective in getting the government to step down. And I think there's something very interesting going on just at our moment in world history where, there's a consolidation of wealth, there's a consolidation of opportunities, some opportunity hoarding by elites in many countries. And, it's often students who are at the forefront of pushing back on that because students are themselves, elites. They have a relative degree of education. And when they look around and they see no opportunity for themselves, they don't feel like the world is going to get better. It's going to get worse. They're going to have fewer opportunities than their parents. Then you get a lot of discontent. And so I don't think it's a surprise that we see young people at the vanguard of these movements. But then, of course, there's a very interesting challenge of channeling that energy into meaningful reform. And that's a whole different stage where, I think we'd have to look case by case about whether that actually happens.
I was just in Serbia recently, and there's a similar phenomenon happening there with students in law schools and in the public universities playing a leadership role in protests, objecting to many of the actions that a lot of people say are corruption, of the current Serbian president. And there was one protest in particular, and it's still ongoing, that started after a train station collapsed and killed, I think, almost 20 people because of sort of bad public construction. And I was just there, and it was actually really powerful and moving, first of all, to see what the students had accomplished. They had sort of shut down a lot of the universities. They were engaged in this very peaceful protest in which they would just stop traffic on street corners and just stand there in moments of silence to recall the people that had died in the train station collapse. But also seeing how the faculty and institutions had supported them. And obviously it's not, there's a lot of resistance too, right? Because people aren't being paid and, people want things to go forward. But I do agree with you that there is this kind of moment where you sort of see something happening where a younger generation, as you said, that feels like its opportunities are being diminished, are acting. And you've written about backsliding, which is what we're seeing, right? Democracies that are moving towards authoritarianism. But I'm curious also about this phenomenon of front sliding, where you can sort of see authoritarian countries moving into democracy, and wondering if this is one of the features that you would look for, or like how you would see student protests in that context.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, there's been a lot of depressing news for students of democracy around the world. And Bangladesh, by the way, is a happy story. It's one of the very rare moments. And it reminds us that all the news isn't bad, that sometimes you do have successful movements to oust dictators and to try to improve the society. And, it's a fragile thing and it will be imperfect, but still, it's better than it was 2 years ago, without question. And that's remarkable. I want to add, by the way, that Bangladesh is a country of 175 million people in territory smaller than the state of Illinois, with 12 million people. So it's a very intense place. I was just there in January. And it was, it gives, I think, some hope that a place like that, which is not wealthy, which is, not that well developed, can move towards good governance. I do think people everywhere want to live in freedom. And so then the question is, well, what's the role of the student movements and such? And, I do think that this is, again, where, it's critical that there be public pressure. It's basically our theory of democracy. Like, how is democracy sustained? Who's enforcing constitutional democracy? And sometimes we might say, oh, it's the courts, or it's the bureaucracy or something like that that's keeping our democracy going when you have sort of authoritarian political movements. But that actually begs the question, because it doesn't tell us why people obey the courts, why there's obedience to norms which are articulated by authoritative institutions. And in the literature, the theoretical answers ultimately comes back to the people, that the people and their threat of all showing up in the street is really what keeps politicians in line. Of course, it doesn't happen very often. It's very hard to coordinate around a particular event. And that's what we just saw in Minnesota. They're going to shoot an unarmed protester, and then they're going to shoot an armed protester, but then lie about it. And when everyone could see with their own eyes what happened, that became a focal point for people to show up and say, enough. And that's really what we look for in with public protests. And you could see that with the student movement in Bangladesh, it's the same story. It starts with like, enough, we need some opportunity here. And then things can spin out of control. Once people are out in the streets, you never know what's going to happen. We sometimes repression works, as unfortunately in Iran at the exact, just in the last couple of months. And that's really depressing, obviously. But Bangladesh is a reminder that it can go the other way.
I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of front sliding because, I think you're right. Obviously, it's the people that hold states accountable, but there's supposed to be many different ways that the people can do that. And it shouldn't always have to be like going out in the street and, having these kind of social moments that can be dangerous, can be violent, can be destabilizing. We're supposed to build institutions that reflect social will, and those institutions are then supposed to keep states in check as well, right? And one of the things I think that's happening in the U.S. right now is that we're watching those institutions maybe fray in such a way that it's making us wonder whether or not those institutions were protective in the first place. So the courts, for example, common law in the United States, the Constitution in the United States is supposed to be a reflection of like the will of the people, but then it's supposed to have its own life. And now we're kind of watching that life fall apart a bit. Can you talk a little bit more about the other features that you would want to see on front sliding that are more institutionally based and how you see those evolve when a state is moving back towards democratic stability?
Yeah, that's a great question. So institutions are really difficult to build and somewhat easy to erode, as we're seeing. And so it's going to be an open question for the United States. We've really seen the degradation of institutions like the prosecution, the Department of Justice, the bureaucracy, the courts. Not total degradation. The courts are still the courts, but some of them obviously seem to have been captured according to popular perception. And that perception is what's critical. So there's not a lot of literature and a lot of experience about how you rebuild institutions after backsliding. We know how you sort of build them from scratch after a major social transformation like the end of communism. We know something about that. We have very little experience about what happens when the agents of institutional erosion are out and you have an opportunity to rebuild. Poland right now is going through a bit of that, but I think Sri Lanka is another case in this region. So what do? Well, first of all, as Professor Aziz Haq and I wrote in a piece on this a few years ago, there's no playbook. It's pragmatics. It's like, which institutions can you kind of rebuild and restore some trust in? Every single one of them matters. So, you start with what's available and you shore up those institutions and prevent them from being captured. That's typically captured and corrupted. Those are the key threats to institutions. So those which are still operating, you've got to shore up, and those which have been degraded, you have to clean up. And that's tricky, just as with all questions of transitional justice, which is what this touches on. They're very tricky questions. Who do you replace? Who do you go after? Which members of the institution need to be removed because they were agents of degradation, and which can be kept? And we in our paper, which is called The Pragmatics of Front Sliding, we say, there's not a formula. It's not necessarily the case that everyone who is appointed illegally, which is what happened to Polish judges, needs to be kicked out. The question has to be a bit forward-looking if you're talking about front sliding. Will these folks be able to contribute to, or at least not harm, the process of institutional revitalization? And so I think we're going to learn a lot about that, and there's going to be some writing on that too these days.
I want to turn to the issue of women's rights in Bangladesh because, one of the things Rafia is a women human rights defender, obviously, and she talked some about the challenges to being a woman that's involved in political activism. It's really online that a lot of political expression is taking place now where it's most impactful. And we're seeing this kind of like epidemic rise of gender-based violence, technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which is not a surprise. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the environment for women's political representation and participation in Bangladesh, and the kinds of like challenges essentially that Rafia is facing in her work?
Yeah. Well, Bangladesh is a very interesting country because it's been led by women for decades now. Both Sheikh Hasina and then Khaleda Zia, who died in December, who had been in jail for 15 years before that. So it's been led by women. It's also a country where we learned a lot about how important it is to empower poor women. So, if you could just get girls to stay in school past a certain number of years, that had huge developmental implications. Micro lending, the famous institution developed by the current interim president, Muhammad Yunus, relied on women initially. You would lend money to women. And so it is a place where these issues have been recognized. And yet the phenomenon you have just identified, which is the online viciousness, the awful speech which women activists and women generally are subjected to online, is a universal thing. And it is a powerful force that even a relatively moderate country like Bangladesh is subjected to. So I find it, obviously very disturbing. The amount of courage it takes to be Rafia is a lot greater than a male counterpart. And I think that's important to recognize. I, in general, was just stunned by the courage and poise of the young people in this country. They, knew that they couldn't live under this regime. They put their lives at great personal risk, and many of them died. And they're proud of that. And I think they're now in the position where they're going to defend that. But as you say, it's something we've got to try to figure out as a society, how online space can be safe for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think it's important to point out, the online space is often reflective of what's happening in reality, right? Bangladesh does have a high incidence of domestic violence, gender-based violence. There's one study that finds that 76% of women claim that they have experienced intimate partner violence, either emotional or physical, in Bangladesh. So, these dynamics end up being more difficult to deal with, I think, without private sector cooperation online, because they're harder to target. But it creates an environment where it becomes very difficult for women to be able to express themselves, and that's what makes what Rafia is doing, I think, even more amazing. And it's not without cost, she mentioned, that she'd had this moment where she was wondering the impact of her work on her family. And that's, just a devastating thing for a young person to have to think about, who's really just fighting for a basic sense of justice in their community. So that's a hard reality.